Greetings to everyone. My name is Jens Reinke. I am the director of the Institute for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism, ISHB at University of the West. I warmly welcome you in the name of the Institute to the commencement of our monthly lecture series. The lecture series is organized by the Institute's scholarly working group, Modern and Contemporary Buddhist Encounters in the Southern Sinosphere, which is part of the Institute's overarching initiative to promote the multifaceted study of Chinese Buddhism under the global condition. The working group examines post-19th century entanglements amongst Buddhist actors and their surrounding societies throughout the Southern Sinosphere, a region comprised of the South China Sea and its bordering countries. Today's lecture by Dr. Jack Chia is the first of 7 lectures held by members of the research group. Jack Meng-Tat Chia is Assistant Professor of History and Religious Studies at the National University of Singapore. His research focuses on Buddhism and Chinese popular religion in Southeast Asia, transnational Buddhism, and Sino-Southeast Asian interactions. His first book, Monks in Motion, Buddhism and Modernity Across the South China Sea, which will be the focus of our lecture today, won the 2021 European Association for Southeast Asian Studies Humanities Book Prize. Dr. Chia has also published articles in journals such as Archipel, Asian Ethnology, China Quarterly, Contemporary Buddhism, History of Religions, and the Journal of Chinese Religions. He's an editor of Asian Culture and serves on the editorial boards of Contemporary Buddhism, Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, and Studies on Humanistic Buddhism. Furthermore, he recently received a Social Science and Humanities Research Fellowship from the Social Science Research Council, Singapore, to work on his new book project, Diplomatic Dharma, Buddhist Diplomacy in Modern Asia. Congratulations to you. Before we start, just a few more words on the format of this evening's event. Dr. Chia will give his presentation for about 40 minutes, followed by 20 minutes for questions from the audience. The Q&A session will be moderated by Dr. Vivian Walters, the Institute's graduate affiliate. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box at any time during the talk. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Chia.
Thank you so much, Ian, for the very kind and generous introduction. Dear friends and colleagues, thank you so much for tuning in to my book talk. It's wonderful to see so many friends and familiar faces. I'm grateful to the Institute for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism at the University of the West for hosting my book talk. I would also like to thank Jens for the generous invitation to share my research. So let me begin by sharing my slides. I will begin my talk by looking at the Malay archipelago. The Malay archipelago, oftentimes referred to as Maritime Southeast Asia, consists of the Muslim majority Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, Catholic Philippines, and Chinese Buddhist majority Singapore. In earlier times, this region saw the rise and fall of several Hindu Buddhist kingdoms, followed with the arrival of Islam in the Malay archipelago during the 13th century, leading to large-scale conversion of the population to Islam. By the 20th century, Islam is the religion of approximately 140 million people in Southeast Asia, concentrated in the Malay archipelago. Indonesia, in fact, has the world's largest Muslim population. And Singapore, where I'm right now, on the other hand, has stood out in the maritime world of Southeast Asia for its Chinese and Buddhist majority population. Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia during modern times has little or nothing to do with the early Hindu Buddhist kingdoms of Srivijaya and Majapahit. The majority of Buddhists in present-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore are ethnic Chinese who migrated to Southeast Asia or were born to their immigrant parents in the 19th and 20th centuries. Unknown to many, perhaps, a significant feature in the Chinese migration to maritime Southeast Asia was the dissemination and development of Buddhism in the Chinese diaspora. However, the term Southeast Asian Buddhism calls to mind Theravada Buddhism, the dominant religion in the mainland Southeast Asian states of Burma, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. While Vietnam is considered a part of mainland Southeast Asia, Vietnamese Buddhism, which mostly belongs to the Mahayana tradition, is often regarded as a part of East Asian Buddhism, which is based on the Chinese language canon and is widely practiced in China, Japan, and Korea. In contrast, Maritime Southeast Asia conjures the image of the Malay archipelago consisting of the Muslim majority states of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, as well as the predominantly Catholic Philippines. Singapore, on the other hand, is deemed as an anomaly because of the predominant Chinese and, in fact, Mahayana Buddhist population. Scholars of Southeast Asia tend to highlight the culture and historical differences between mainland and maritime Southeast Asia by emphasizing the religious contrast between mainland Theravada Buddhism and maritime Islam and Catholicism to conceptualize the religious diversity of Southeast Asia as a region. In doing so, these studies fail to recognize the presence of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia and its importance among Chinese communities in the predominantly Islamic and Catholic region. On the other hand, scholars of Buddhism have often limited the study of Southeast Asian Buddhism to the Theravada Buddhist majority on the mainland. For instance, Donna Sherritt's seminal work, The Buddhist World of Southeast Asia, that we see here, focuses only on Theravada Buddhism in Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, while Anne Hansen's article on modern Buddhism in Southeast Asia recognizes the presence of a vibrant Chinese Buddhist minority in Malaysia at the end of her essay. In other words, previous scholarship has considered the category of Southeast Asian Buddhism to be almost synonymous with Theravada Buddhism. There are three possible reasons to explain the dichotomy between mainland Theravada Buddhism and Islamic and maritime Islam and Catholicism in the study of Southeast Asia. First, this could be attributed to the historiography of writing nation-state history of Southeast Asia. Scholars of Southeast Asian Buddhism and historians of Southeast Asia generally tend to write the narrative of Southeast Asian countries in a linear fashion from early modern Buddhist kingdoms to modern Buddhist majority nation states. The narrative of the development of Buddhist kingdoms neglects the Chinese presence and the connectivity of Buddhist monks across the South China Sea. A second reason could be the form of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia. The majority of Buddhists in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore are ethnic Chinese following Mahayana Buddhism. Therefore, scholars of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asian states tend to come from a background of sinology and East Asian Buddhist studies, and to consider Chinese Buddhism in Southeast Asia as an extension of Chinese Buddhism rather than as Southeast Asian Buddhism. Additionally, many of them publish their work in Chinese, making them inaccessible to scholars of Southeast Asian Buddhism who do not read the language. Third, and closely related to the second reason, academic boundaries and institutional limitations create a gap between scholars trained in Southeast Asian Buddhism and in East Asian Buddhism. While students of Southeast Asian Buddhism are linguistically trained in Pali in mainland Southeast Asian languages, students of East Asian Buddhism usually study Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and a modern European research language. For this reason, scholars of Southeast Asian Buddhism are equipped with country-specific linguistic and cultural knowledge under the assumption that they will be studying Theravada Buddhism on the mainland. My book, Monks in Motion, is a study of Chinese Buddhist migration in the 20th century. It also tells the connected history of Buddhist communities in China and maritime Southeast Asia. I have explored the intellectual and institutional history of Buddhism in China and in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore through the lives and careers of three prominent monks that we see over here, Zhu Mo, Yan Pei, and Asing Jarakita. I demonstrate how their education, travels, monastic affiliations, and interactions with the post-colonial nation states have contributed to the emergence of a field of belief and practice that are called South China Sea Buddhism. By South China Sea Buddhism, I refer to the forms of Buddhism in Maritime Southeast Asia, which use Mandarin Chinese, Southern Chinese dialects, and Southeast Asian languages in their liturgy and scriptures that have emerged out of Buddhist connections across the South China Sea. In coining the term South China Sea Buddhism, I draw on M. Blackburn's work on Indian Ocean Buddhism. In sketching out an intellectual case for Indian Ocean Buddhism, M. Blackburn emphasizes the connected history of Buddhist communities in South and Southeast Asia. I find the idea of Indian Ocean Buddhism, a term that Blackburn used to analyze Buddhist mobility and networks across the region, helpful to my discussion of monastic migrations and networks across China and Southeast Asia. Monks in Motion tells a history of monastic and institutional connectivity in the South China Sea during the 20th century, which emerged due to Chinese migration and to larger forces of social political changes that took place in China and in Southeast Asia. My research into Southeast Asian Buddhism is propelled by three questions. Why did Buddhist monks migrate from China to Southeast Asia? How did they participate in the transnational Buddhist networks across the South China Sea? What were the broader implications of these connections? In addition to documenting Zhumo, Yanpei, and Asing Jarakita's ideas, activities, and projects, my book has two aims. First, to present the connected history of Buddhist communities in China and Maritime Southeast Asia through synthesizing institutional and intellectual history, as well as local and global history. My focus here is how migrant monks acted as agents of knowledge production in the process of selective reformation of Chinese Buddhism by reconfiguring Buddhist ideas through negotiation. Second, to challenge conventional categories of Chinese Buddhism and Southeast Asian Buddhism by focusing on the lesser known, yet no less historically significant Chinese Buddhist communities in Southeast Asia. I demonstrate that Chinese migration contributed to the spread of Buddhism and establishment of new institutions in the diaspora. My talk today is divided into four parts. First, I will explore Chinese migration to Maritime Southeast Asia between the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, explaining how overseas Chinese came to play an important role in spreading Buddhism from China to the Malay archipelago. Second, I will examine the transnational career of Zhumo, examining his activities and religious spaces in Malaysia during the second half of the 20th century. Next, I will focus on the case of Yanpei, reviewing how Singapore's Buddhist history was intertwined with the larger history of migration and the modernization of Chinese Buddhism. Finally, I will discuss Asing Jarakita's attempt to make Buddhism less Chinese in order to safeguard the survival of Buddhism as a minority religion in Muslim-majority Indonesia. Then I will begin with Chinese migration. Large-scale Chinese migration began in the mid-19th century and lasted through the 1930s. The massive movement of the Chinese population could be attributed to both the push factors within China and the pull factors in Southeast Asia. Qing China's defeat in the Opium War and the subsequent signing of unequal treaties had significant consequences on Chinese migration to Southeast Asia. In essence, colonialism in Southeast Asia, coupled with the Western opening of China, created a mechanism for moving Chinese labor from China to Southeast Asia. Chinese migrants were active agents in spreading numerous deity cults into Southeast Asia. For many migrants, the long journey to foreign lands filled them with a sense of anxiety and uncertainty, prompting them to turn towards religious belief and practices which not only fulfilled the spiritual needs of the migrants, but also enhanced their confidence and gave them a greater sense of security in their new work and living environment in colonial Southeast Asia. For instance, the Empress of Heaven, Tian Ho, also known as Ma-Zu, was probably the most popular goddess in the Chinese diaspora, given its popular regard as protector of seafarers. At the same time, Local native place deities such as Guangzhou Zunwang, Baoshen Dadi, and Qingshui Zhushi that were peculiar and important to specific dialect groups also accompanied the Chinese migrants to Southeast Asia. The overseas Chinese communities worship these deities for a variety of reasons, including others like longevity, fertility, marriage, promotion, and protection. As revealed in a number of sources, overseas Chinese did not distinguish Buddhist deities from Chinese local gods, and they worshiped their sacred images by lighting candles and incense sticks. Many Chinese venerated the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas along with Taoist deities and practiced the Confucian rite of ancestor worship. This form of so-called pre-institutional Chinese Buddhism, which some scholars call the unity of three teachings or 三教合一 of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, was common among the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia. Furthermore, Chinese merchants, not Buddhist monks, were responsible for running Buddhist temples in Southeast Asia prior to the last decade of the 19th century. The early migrant monks who resided and performed religious ceremonies in the temples were less educated and could barely understand the meanings and importance of the Buddhist scriptures in classical Chinese. The institutional form of Chinese Buddhism appeared in Maritime Southeast Asia during the last decade of the 19th century. By institutional Buddhism, I refer to Buddhism as an organized religion with its systems of teachings, rituals, clerics, and organizations. The arrival of educated Chinese monks in the Malay archipelago contributed to the institutionalization of Buddhism and the subsequent monastery building efforts among the overseas Chinese communities. Moreover, unlike their predecessors who were primarily ritual specialists, this new breed of migrant monks who received their monastic training in China were concerned with the dissemination of Buddhist doctrines to the overseas Chinese. Between the second half of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, social political changes in China gave rise to a Buddhist modernist movement, which in turn contributed to the making of vibrant South China Sea Buddhist networks. In a nutshell, the Buddhist modernist movement in China during the early half of the 20th century was characterized by reform of the leadership system in the Buddhist monasteries, founding of Buddhist research institutions such as lay and women's organizations, publishing of Buddhist periodicals, printing and distribution of free Dharma books, and opening of Buddhist libraries, setting up Buddhist academies, and the promotion of Buddhist charitable activities. These Buddhist reformers participated in the kind of modernist projects as defined by Anne Hansen and David McMahon, making claims of the relevance of Buddhist doctrines to the issues of the time and promoted Buddhism based on national particularity. Taishi, one of the most prominent figures among the Chinese Buddhist modernists during the Republican period, he was one of the most prominent figures. Born in 1890 in Chongde, county of Zhejiang province, he became a novice in Jiangsu and received his higher ordination at the Tiantong Monastery. After the founding of the Republic, Taishi spearheaded the Buddhist revival movement of 佛教复兴运动 and advocated the need to reform the monastic system and promote education. He advocated human life Buddhism, 人生佛教, to revitalize Chinese Buddhism. His ideas of human life Buddhism were aimed at changing the existing image and understanding of Buddhism, and a shift of Buddhism as a shift of the emphasis of Buddhism as a religion for the day to emphasize on the practice of Buddhism for this worldly life, addressing the social and spiritual problems of 20th century China. Under the abbacy of Taishi, Nanputuo Monastery became a headquarters for the Buddhist modernist movement in Southeast China, and it became a key nodal point in the networks connecting modernist monks in Southern China and the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia. The South China Sea Buddhist networks were crucial in the trans-regional circulations of people, ideas, and resources between China and Southeast Asia. The religious connections on the one hand facilitated the movement of Buddhist monks from China to Southeast Asia and fostered the dissemination of Buddhist modernist ideas to the overseas Chinese communities. On the other hand, these networks were used to transfer resources from Southeast Asia to fund religious activities in China. For instance, as the abbot of Nam Pu Tuo Monastery, Taishi made 3 visits to Singapore in 1926, 1928, and 1940 to leverage on the South China Sea networks to seek donations from overseas Chinese and to raise funds for his renovation plans for the Nam Pu Tuo Monastery, as well as for his education project at the Minnan Buddhist Institute. During his first visit in 1926, Taishi met with prominent Chinese businessmen and became friends with Dang Kaki and Ao Boon Ho. Taishi's friendship with these influential local Chinese leaders demonstrates the importance of trans-regional South China Sea networks, allowing him to seek financial support from wealthy business elites in the diaspora and opportunities to preach his idea of human life Buddhism to them. The arrival of modernist Buddhist ideas further contributed to the institutionalization of Chinese Buddhism in Maritime Southeast Asia during the first half of the 20th century. Taishi had ambitious plans to spread his ideas of human life Buddhism beyond China and wanted to organize an ecumenical Buddhist movement to extend the reach of his modernist ideas. In September 1926, Taishi came to Singapore and gave a series of talks at the Victoria Memorial Hall, which attracted a large crowd of overseas Chinese. As most of the Buddhist monasteries in Singapore during the early 20th century were disconnected from the laity, Taishi suggested that the establishment of a lay Buddhist association would be beneficial in propagating the Dharma to the overseas Chinese communities. This proposal inspired Ning Dayun, a prominent householder in Singapore, who founded the Chinese Buddhist Association, or Zhonghua Fujiaohui, with assistance from Zhuan Dao a year later in 1927. The Chinese Buddhist Association became an important institution for the promotion of Buddhist modernist movement in Singapore by providing education and welfare services for the overseas Chinese community. By the turn of the 20th century, the development of institutional Buddhism in Maritime Southeast Asia was linked to and enabled by broader events in China. By the end of the 1940s, there was a larger presence of Buddhist organizations in Maritime Southeast Asia. We will now look at the development of Buddhism in the region and the ways in which Zhu Mo, Yan Pei, and Asin Jirakita promoted their respective forms of Buddhist modernism in the Chinese diaspora. Today, many Malaysian Buddhists consider Zhu Mo to be the father of Malaysia's Chinese Buddhism. In 1913, Chen De'an, who would become Zhu Mo, was born near the foot of Mount Yandang in the Leqing County of Zhejiang Province. He became a monk when he was 12 and later enrolled at the Minnan Buddhist Institute in Xiamen, where he became a student of Taishi. Following the Communist Party's victory and the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, many Chinese monks feared communist hostility towards religion and hence decided to leave mainland China. Zhu Mo first left for Macau, which was under Portuguese rule, to become the founding advisor of the Macau Buddhist Society. In 1954, he migrated to Penang and remained in Malaysia until his death in 2002. During his 5-decade religious career in Malaysia, he served as an advisor to the Porte School, founded and served as the inaugural president of the Malaysian Buddhist Association, established the Triple Wisdom Hall, and started the Malaysian Buddhist Institute. In 1998, Zhu Mo became the first Buddhist monk in Malaysia to receive the title of Datuk from the head of state of Penang for his contributions to Buddhism and religious harmony in Malaysia. Zhu Mo redefined the basis of being Buddhist in Malaysia by drawing on Taishi's modernist ideas of human life Buddhism. He encouraged intra-religious conversion by advocating a Malaysian Chinese Buddhist identity that emphasized this worldly practice of Buddhism, promoted a vision of Buddhist orthodoxy or 真正佛教, and established new Buddhist institutions for the promotion of education. By examining the Malaysian context with the idea of South China Sea Buddhism in mind, we are able to see the connected history of Buddhist communities in China and Southeast Asia. Chinese Buddhist migration has contributed to a redefinition of the concept of being Buddhist in Malaysia and created a Malaysian Chinese Buddhist identity based on the idea of human life Buddhism. I will now show a very short video clip of more talking about taking refuge.
善于讲经说法的竺摩长老吸引了许多信众前来听经。
When Tumo first migrated to Penang, the majority of Malaysian Chinese knew little about Buddhist doctrines and practiced a mix of Buddhism, Taoism, and Chinese popular religious practices. Furthermore, Buddhism was commonly associated with death and funeral rites. Tumo advocated for national Buddhist identity based on the principle of human life Buddhism, stressing the need to incorporate Buddhism into one's life, practice Orthodox Buddhism, and more importantly, take refuge in the Triple Gems. In other words, he wanted to invent a new definition of being Buddhist for the Malaysian Buddhist community. To promote Buddhist education, Tumo contributed to the expansion of the Porte School and established the Malaysian Buddhist Association, Triple Wisdom Hall, and Malaysian Buddhist Institute, which were crucial in disseminating doctrinal knowledge and facilitating intra-religious conversion among the Chinese Buddhist community in Malaysia. Next, we will look at Emp. Singaporean Buddhists generally remember Emp as a scholar, social worker, monk, responsible for bringing the ideas of humanistic Buddhism or 人间佛教 to Southeast Asia and promoting them in his lectures, writings, and social activism. Most of his writings were published in a 34-volume collection entitled Collected Works of Mindful Observation, or 地观全集, and a 12-volume sequel entitled A Sequel to the Mindful Observation, 地观续集, making him the most prolific Chinese Buddhist writer of the period in Southeast Asia. Emp was born in 1917 in a poor farming family in Yangzhou City in Jiangsu Province. In 1929, he was ordained as a monk. Emp was very much a product of the Buddhist modernist movement in Republican China. Like many of his contemporaries, such as Tumo, Emp received formal monastic training at Buddhist seminaries, where he was influenced by Taishi's vision of human life Buddhism and Yin Sun's ideas of humanistic Buddhism. Following the communist victory and the establishment of the PRC in 1949, Emp left China for Hong Kong and later settled in Taiwan with his teacher and friend Yin Sun. Here's a short video clip of an interview of an oral history interview with Emp, where he talked about his relationship with Taishi and Yin Sun.
当时我们是预备参与这一个正班听课，但是太虚大师呢要我们旁听，同时指定我们呢跟应顺老师呢求一的方法。
So that was how he became a student and a close friend of Master Yin Sun. During Emp's decade-long career in Taiwan, between 1952 and 1964, he made 3 trips to Southeast Asia in 1958, 1961, and 1964, where he contributed to the conversations between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhist monastics and established connections with the Southeast Asian Buddhist communities. Yempe initially wanted to migrate and spread Buddhism in Vietnam, but was unable to do so because of the Vietnam War. In 1964, he came to Singapore and spent the remaining 32 years of his life building a Buddhist community in post-colonial Singapore. His religious career in Singapore can be divided into two phases. The first as the abbot of the Ling Feng Prashna Auditorium, the Ling Feng Pura Jiangtang from 1964 to 1979, and subsequently as a social activist and founding chairman of the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services from 1980 to his death in 1996. During the first phase of his career, Yempe was concerned with the lack of Dharma activities in Singapore. He wanted to build a modern auditorium and pioneered activities such as weekly Dharma lectures, group practices, and Sunday school, which were uncommon among Buddhist organizations during that time. Yempe also relied on his networks to make his auditorium a nodal point in the global Buddhist networks, allowing him to invite monks from Asia, Australia, and North America to visit and speak to his congregation. The publication and circulation of his collected works of mindful observation earned him a reputation as one of the preeminent scholar monks of Chinese Buddhism in the region. In the second phase of his religious career, Yempe became a social activist and founded the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services. He was actively engaged with secular social issues that were of concern in Singaporean society. Yempe's Buddhist Welfare Services played an important role in promoting elder care and filial piety, organ donation and kidney dialysis, and drug prevention and rehabilitation against the backdrop of a rapidly developing Singapore. Yempe preached Buddhist doctrines not only to justify the need for Singaporean Buddhists to be socially relevant and contribute to social welfare, but also went so far as to say that Buddhist teachings could be used as practical solutions to addressing national issues. The Singapore government awarded Yempe the Public Service Medal and the Public Service Star to recognize his contributions to social welfare and medical services. Last but not least, we will now turn our attention to Asing Jayarakita. Widely regarded as the first Indonesian-born Buddhist monk, Asing Jayarakita took it as his mission to propagate Buddhism in the archipelago nation. His Buddhayana movement, which combined the doctrines and practices of Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism, created an inclusive and non-sectarian Buddhist community. Asing Jayarakita crafted a vision of Indonesian Buddhism, or Agama Buddha Indonesia, as it calls it, as a diverse yet unified religion in line with the motto of unity in diversity of the modern Indonesian nation. Later, he introduced the concept of Sankhya Ati Buddha to make Buddhism compatible with the first principle of the Pancasila, the 5 philosophical pillars of Indonesia during the New Order era. Asing Jayarakita was born in 1923 in Bogor, a city in West Java, at the time part of the Dutch colony of the East Indies. He was given the name Tibon An by his Chinese immigrant parents. His early exposure to Buddhism at Chinese temples or clamping was primarily through chanting and vegetarianism. Unlike Zhu Mo and Yempe, who were born in China, Asing Jayarakita was a Peranakan Chinese born and raised in the Dutch East Indies. He was educated in the Dutch colonial education system and later studied chemistry in the Netherlands. In 1953, Tibon An was ordained as a novice at Gong Hok Si or Huang Hua Si in Jakarta by Ben Qing, where he was given the Dharma name Ti Zhen. After several months of monastic training, Ti Zhen decided to seek higher ordination to become a bhikkhu. The lack of the required numbers of monks for the transmission of precepts, however, made it impossible for him to be fully ordained in Indonesia. Therefore, Ti Zhen decided to seek higher ordination in the Chinese Mahayana tradition in mainland China. But he was unable to do so as religious activities were restricted under the communist regime. Consequently, Ti Zhen was reordained and received his higher ordination in the Theravada tradition under Mahasi Sayadaw in Burma, who gave him the name Jinarakita. Unlike his contemporaries in Malaysia and Singapore, who attempted to spread ideas of Buddhist modernism among the Chinese community, Asing Jayakita tried to make Buddhism less Chinese as a calculated strategy to ensure the survival of Buddhism as a minority religion in the world's largest Muslim nation. He founded the Buddhayana movement that promoted non-sectarian doctrines and practices to be in line with the national discourse of unity in diversity. The Buddhayana movement conceptualizes Buddhism as a religion within three concentric circles that we see over here. The innermost circle is the core teaching and the liberating dimension of Buddhism. The next circle is the method, which is varied according to the personal capacity and karmic circumstances of the practitioner. Finally, the outermost circle is culture, which makes one form of Buddhism seemingly different from another. In terms of practice, Asing Jayakita encouraged a non-sectarian mixing of doctrines and liturgy. He preached that Buddhists should not become fixated on a single sectarian practice and should not consider another approach to be wrong and inferior. On a personal level, Asing Jayakita kept the Theravada precepts of not handling money and not eating after midday, and he maintained the Mahayana practice of vegetarianism. According to my interviewees, he did so to bridge the Vinaya practices of both traditions. Later in the 1980s, he grew a beard to look like Mahayana elder monk, but continued to dress in Theravada robes. From his personal practice and his appearance, it was evident that Asing Jayakita wanted to stress that he was neither a Theravada nor a Mahayana monk, a combination of both. Following the 30th of September movement in 1965, Suharto became president and ushered in 31 years of authoritarian rule known as the New Order that lasted until his resignation in 1998. Suharto's government blamed Communist China for the 30th of September movement and its influence over the Indonesian Communist Party, and decided to cut diplomatic ties with the People's Republic of China in 1967. The government passed a series of laws and presidential orders to association aimed at Chinese Indonesians and emphasized the Pancasila principle of belief in one God, using religion as a force to counter atheist communist influence. To make Buddhism compatible with the first principle of the Pancasila, Asing Jayakita introduced the concept of Sanghya Apit Buddha as the Buddhist version of an almighty God. He claimed that the concept of Sanghya Apit Buddha could be found in the Sanghang Kamahayanikan, a 10th century text produced during the reign of King Sindok in East Java. Following Asing Jayakita's rediscovery of Sanghya Apit Buddha from ancient Javanese texts, he mobilized his disciples from various parts of Indonesia to spread these ideas. However, Sanghya Apit Buddha was a double-edged sword for Asing Jayakita and his Buddhayana movement. On the one hand, the concept was accepted by the Suharto government, thus ensuring that Buddhism continued to be one of the recognized religions in Indonesia, as we can see in the picture here. Asing Jayakita later became a good friend of then President Suharto. Yet, on the other hand, some of Asing Jayakita's followers became critical of his theistic explanation of Buddhism and broke away from the Buddhayana movement. I will now show you a short video clip of a Buddhayana birthday song, which I recorded during my fieldwork in Indonesia. It's interesting to note also as well that in order to combine the practices of Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, so as you know, the lay Buddhists in the Mahayana tradition usually wear the black Buddhist robe known as Haiqing, while Theravada Buddhists usually wear white-colored clothing during religious festivals and ceremonies. So Buddhayana combined the two practices and introduced the white Haiqing. So the lay Buddhists actually wear the white Haiqing for their Buddhist rituals and ceremonies. So I'm going to show you a very interesting video clip of them singing an Indonesian Buddhist birthday song.
Kami sedang
birthday today. Selamat ulang tahun to you. In Monks in Motion, I have explored the history and Chinese Buddhist migration, settlement, integration, and networks in the 20th century through two main themes. The first concerns the attempt to write a connected history of Buddhist communities in China and Maritime Southeast Asia. The other explores the role of Chinese diasporic monks in the making of Buddhist modernism in the Maritime Southeast Asian states of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. I will conclude here with some directions for future research in the hope that other more linguistically endowed scholars will pursue further studies on the connected history of Buddhist communities in China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and mainland and Maritime Southeast Asia. In the first place, the evidence of Chinese Mahayana and Southeast Asian Theravada Buddhist connections discussed in my book reveals that Chinese diasporic monks were interested in going to mainland Southeast Asia to exchange ideas and learn from their Pali-oriented colleagues during the 20th century. That is, the South China Sea Buddhist networks linking the Chinese monks to Maritime Southeast Asia have also connected Chinese Buddhists of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore in touch with Buddhist institutions and monastics in Burma, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. There remains much to learn about the patterns of Buddhist circulations in South China Sea and the ways in which modernist Buddhist ideas overlap with and perhaps facilitated one another. Another area deserving further attention is the relationship between modernist Buddhists and pre-institutional Buddhist temples in Maritime Southeast Asia. As we have learned from the case studies of three prominent South China Sea monks, modernist Buddhists attempted to promote their visions of religious orthodoxies by setting themselves apart from pre-institutional Buddhist practices. There were Chinese Buddhists who participated and moved freely between modernist and pre-institutional Buddhist organizations without having to give up one over the other. Overlapping commercial, clan, and religious ties among the overseas Chinese communities in Maritime Southeast Asia may have made it difficult, if not impossible, to have a clear-cut separation between modernist monks and pre-institutional Buddhist groups. How did the collaboration or conflict impact the religious landscape in Maritime Southeast Asia? Finally, for the time period considered in my book, Chinese monks fled communist China and supported anti-communist initiatives in Taiwan and Maritime Southeast Asia. Some recent and forthcoming works have revealed that Buddhists became embroiled in the Cold War politics of mainland Southeast Asia. Yet little attention has been paid to the ways in which Chinese monks participated in counter-communist activities, or to how they rely on South China Sea Buddhist networks to cultivate activist ties and collaborate with state actors and like-minded Buddhists during the Cold War. Examination of the writings of Chinese monks in Maritime Southeast Asia, along with Burmese, Khmer, Lao, Thai, and Vietnamese sources from the mainland, could help construct a more comprehensive picture of East and Southeast Asian Buddhism during the Cold War era. It is likely that further unpacking of the connected history of Buddhist communities in the region will help us better understand the flow of people, ideas, and resources that shape South China Sea Buddhism. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack, for kicking off our lecture series and for your wonderful talk. I can really recommend everybody to read Jack Chia's book. It's really a groundbreaking study. Okay, let us move on to the question and answer section of the talk. And I will abuse my right as a host to ask two questions first. One question I have is, when you research the life of those three monastics, did you ever encounter the notion of 原始佛教, original Buddhism, this Orientalist notion? And if so, what kind of role did it play? Because for my own study, especially studies on modernist Buddhist monks in Taiwan, especially those with relation to Inshon, I mean, this notion is very, very influential. And I wonder how the situation is in Maritime Southeast Asia with this very strong presence of Theravada Buddhism. And my second question is, do we know of any female monastics, modernist or not, who were coming to Southeast Asia during the time. Of course, we know of Yenpei and Zihang, and there's all these famous big men. But what about the nuns? Do we have any data about nuns? Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Ian, for your questions. Great questions. Your question on original Buddhism, that's something really is a really fascinating issue to explore further. But for many of the modern Chinese modernist monks, their idea of original Buddhism, or so-called 原始佛教, as you rightly point out, especially those who studied with Ying Sun, the definition of so-called original Buddhism actually refers to Indian Buddhism. And Ying Shun's idea of 人间佛教 was very much based on his idea of original Buddhism based on the early Indian Buddhist texts, where he actually went back to look at the Nikayas, where he actually was interested to look at how the Hanjing and the early Indian texts actually revealed forms of humanistic Buddhism, and even so far as to claim that this idea of the Bodhisattva practice was actually based on the so-called original Indian Buddhist text, and also how humanistic Buddhism was actually a form of so-called original Buddhism that goes all the way back to Indian Buddhism. And this idea of original Buddhism was actually very different from the way the Theravada Buddhist community interpret Indian original Buddhism, the so-called 原始佛教, especially in mainland Southeast Asia. And that was also one of the issues that Yenpei pointed out in his writing, in his conversations and debate with the Theravada Buddhist monastic during his trips to mainland Southeast Asia. Because through the Theravada monastics on mainland Southeast Asia, the idea of original Buddhism, or the idea of refers to Theravada Buddhism, because they see Theravada Buddhism as the closest form of Buddhism that goes all the way back to the Buddha's time. So their understanding of original Buddhism was quite different from Yenpei and Yushin's idea of original Buddhism. So in his writing, it's very interesting to see the conversation and how be based on the understanding of what original Buddhism entails. And it was actually one of the very, I would say, early kind of conversations between Reformist Chinese monks and Theravada intellectuals on mainland Southeast Asia. The second question is a really excellent, fascinating question that I think really deserves a lot more attention, especially on this on female monastic. So far as I know, there are not that many prominent female monastics that actually migrated to Maritime, in fact, to mainland Southeast Asia. But one of the most prominent nuns that actually appeared in many of the writings was actually this nun by the name of Venerable Fang Lian. And she was actually the nun who actually established the Porte School in Penang, and who actually had connections with the Reformist Buddhist community in Republican China. And at the time, Venerable Fang Lian, who was one of the prominent Reformist nuns who actually promoted Buddhist education, wanted to invite Fa Fang, who was also a student of Taishi and a prominent Buddhist educator, to teach in Penang. But unfortunately, Fa Fang passed away in Sri Lanka. I was unable to become the advisor. So that was when Zumo became the one the next in line to become the founding advisor of the Porte School. So that was the kind of connection. But what I think is important about the Reformist monks that I mentioned in my talk is that they were actually active teachers in ordinating the bhikkhunis in Maritime Southeast Asia. And in fact, many of the prominent students of this of Zhumo, Yenpei, and Asing Jirakita are actually bhikkhunis, and they are now actively teaching the Dharma in Maritime Southeast Asia. So it's very interesting to trace the kind of lineage. And in fact, Asing Jirakita was, I would say, a very interesting figure in the sense that even though he was reordained and received his higher ordination in the Theravada tradition, he was actually very active in recruiting female monastic into his Buddhayana movement. And one of the reasons he explained was that because he was ordained first as a Mahayana monk, and of course the ordination of bhikkhuni has always been a mainstream practice in Mahayana Buddhism. So he thought that it was no problem to do that in Indonesia in his Buddhayana Sangha. So I would say that for his case, it was quite unique, and also he made the decision to actually recruit bhikkhuni into his Buddhayana movement. Thanks for your question, Jens.
Well, thank you so much for the answer. It's very exciting. I'll just hand it over to Riverine now for the questions.
Yes, thank you, Jack. The first question is, so both Yenpei and two more were Taishu's disciples. When did they become his disciples? Did they become disciples in China or Malaysia? And what was their relationship with Taishu like after they were in different countries?
All right, thanks very much for the question. So both Zhumo and Yenpei became students of Taishi when they enrolled at the Mingnan Buddhist Institute. So Taishi became the abbot of Namputuo Monastery and the rector of Mingnan Buddhist Institute in the 1920s, where he actually recruited a lot of young Buddhist monks to study in his Buddhist seminary. So Zhumo first went to Mingnan Institute to study to become a student of Taishi, where he became influenced by Taishi's ideas of human life Buddhism. And then later on, Yenpei also went to become a student at the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, where he became a student of Taishi. But later on, during the Sino-Japanese War in China, where many of the Kuomintang government, as well as the Chinese Buddhist monastic, retreated to Sichuan in Chongqing. And so they actually re-established the Buddhist schools in Chongqing, in the area that was actually far from the Japanese who actually occupied the coastal region. So that was when, in Chongqing, that was when Taishi encouraged Yenpei to become a student of Ying Shun, who was teaching at that time. So that was how Yenpei became a student and a close friend of Ying Shun. As for Ying Shun, it's interesting. He was actually a classmate of Zhumo at the Mingnan Buddhist Institute, and they both studied with Taishi. So in fact, they were classmates at the seminary. So it's also something interesting, I think, to further explore is the kind of Buddhist seminary and education networks among the Buddhist monastic in Republican China. As my colleagues Rong Dao and Eric Hammerstone, they have in recent years tried to explore how Buddhist seminaries actually serve as very important nodal points of Buddhist intellectual networks, but also Buddhist reform movement in the Republican period. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone has any other questions, please put them in the chat box, and I'll turn it back over to Jens. He has another one.
Yeah, there's another question.
Okay, thank you, Jack. I have one more question. I actually have many, many more questions, but one of the questions I have is moving a little bit towards today, right? Because, of course, you talk about as historical reformist monks coming to Maritime Southeast Asia. But what about monks or monastics from mainland China, from the PRC today? Is there, for example, a Lungchuan temple dependance in somewhere in Singapore or Malaysia, or are there other initiatives from mainland Chinese monastics? Of course, we know about the Taiwanese groups like Foguangshan and Siji, but what about the PRC contemporary monastics from the PRC?
Thanks for your question. Yes, this is a really fascinating question. And in fact, I would say that the South Asian Chinese monks play a very important role in the Buddhist revivals in the 1980s and 90s, because they were the ones who actually had access to mainland China after the reform and open door policy. So some of the prominent monks, in fact, like Hong Chuan Fashi, and in fact, Zhumo also went back to mainland China in the 1990s. To actually, many of them, they wanted to rebuild their ancestral monasteries back in China, they rebuild their Zhuting, but they also play an important role in bringing back these ideas of the ideas of reform Buddhism back to mainland China that was actually unfortunately very much destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. So many of the Southeast Asian Buddhist monks not only brought many of the reformist teachings from Southeast Asia back to China, but actually they contributed to the early reconstruction and revival of Chinese Buddhism in the late 1980s, but especially in the 1990s, before the Taiwanese monastic could do it. And the reason actually had to do with the kind of cross-strait relations that was happening at the time. In fact, many of the Taiwanese monks also, or rather the Chinese monks in Taiwan at the time, wanted to return to China to rebuild their monastery and to spread the Dharma as well, but they were not able to do so, partly because of the kind of cross-strait politics, but also the Chinese government in mainland China at the time were very wary of the Taiwanese monastic coming in. So as a result, many of them actually had to rely on Southeast Asian Chinese Buddhists in the kind of a revival effort. Thanks for the question, Ian.
Thank you.
And, thank you. And I think there are some questions in the chat box.
Yes, there are more questions. Vivek.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Ian.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what were the views of these three big reformist monks towards the earlier ritual specialists that did not understand doctrines or even the rituals they performed? Did they try to educate the ritual specialist monks as well?
Thanks for your question, Karen. So in fact, in most of their writings, this prominent reformist monk were quite critical of the early ritual monks because they thought that many of these monks do not understand the Buddhist scriptures, and they were in fact conducting Buddhist funerals more for profit-making purposes. So in fact, they were very critical, and in fact, they in some of their writings, they mentioned that how this kind of ritual, especially the emphasis on ritual practices, was one of the reasons that led to the decline of Buddhism in modern China. So that's why they put a lot of emphasis on Buddhist education and reform, and more importantly, to shift the emphasis from death and funeral rites to Buddhist education and their emphasis on Buddhist doctrines. So whether did they try to educate ritual specialist monks? I don't think so, because the ritual specialist monks, many of them were pretty much doing what they were already doing, basically conducting these rites. And very often, I would say to some extent, it was more of a profit-making enterprise, while this reformist monk, they were pretty against doing that. But yet, on the other hand, it's important to note that many of these so-called Reform Buddhist organizations, they did conduct rituals and ceremonies as well. But then to them, they usually consider that as part of their group practice. They call it gongxiu, rather than what they would consider conducting Buddhist rites for profit, which they usually term it as what those jingchan forces. So we see there's very clear divisions between the reformist monks and the so-called ritual specialists. But as I mentioned towards the end of my talk, I think it's also important to further examine whether there's any overlaps between this reformist monk and pre-institutional Buddhist organization. And I think this is something that I would say we should explore further. So thanks for your question.
Thank you so much. We have two more questions. The next one is, can you provide a case that demonstrates how Master Jumor or Yanpei perceived popular devotion to Chinese deities in overseas Chinese communities while enforcing so-called Orthodox Buddhism at the same time?
Thanks for your question, Soren. In fact, it's interesting that in the writing, especially in the writing of Jumor and Yanpei, they were actually very critical of Buddhists that worship Chinese deities. For instance, in one of the writings by Venerable Jumor, he actually pointed out that how Chinese Buddhists distorted the practice of the veneration of Guanyin, saying that how they worship Guanyin as well, Guanyin Liang Liang and Guanyin Ma, which is unorthodox and an incorrect practice, and how Buddhists should understand the correct scriptures and teachings of the Avalokitesvara. So it's very interesting how it's very critical. And then in another writing, he actually criticized Chinese Buddhists for engaging in Chinese folk practices such as burning joss paper and going to seek fortune telling. So that's very one of the very prominent things that Zhumo wrote about in his writing. And I would say that's the same for Yan Pei as well. And in fact, Yan Pei in his writings, he pointed out that why Chinese Buddhists worship these Chinese deities was because of their lack of knowledge in the Buddhist doctrines. So that's also one of the reasons why after he became the abbot of the Prajna, Lingfeng Prajna Auditorium, one of the things he did was actually to actively engage in Dharma propagation and conducting so-called Sunday schools, which were actually very uncommon at that time. But also one interesting to note is that both Zhumo and Yan Pei, when they started their organization, they actually named their organization an auditorium. They call it the Jiangtang, rather than as a temple or a monastery. And the reason for that is that they were both very much influenced by this reformist ideas of Taishi and Yingsheng. And to them, they thought that having an auditorium to give Dharma lectures was more important than having a place of worship for the Chinese to come and just worship and pray to venerate the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So the emphasis of the Jiangtang, of the auditorium, was to give Dharma lectures and to promote Buddhist education rather than to worship or to engage in the kind of devotional practices. So we see this also very interesting shift in the way how they present Chinese Buddhism, but also the kind of institution they established to do so. Thanks very much for this question.
Thank you so much. We have one last question from Rongdao Lai.
Mm-hmm.
And that question will be asked live.
Thank you. Hey, Jack, thank you for the fascinating talk. I just didn't quite know how to, type that long question, so I thought I'll ask it live. So, going back to your kind of comment earlier about the overlap between the so-called traditionalists and modernists, or the non-modernists and the modernist monks. I was wondering if we're to really zoom in on a timeline for the term, Renjian Fojiao, and when folks were using the term or not, right, Renjian or Rensheng Fojiao. And of course, even in the first half of the 20th century, I think, with the circulation of all these journals and periodicals from even, mainland China to Southeast Asia, the term Renjian or Rensheng Fojiao shouldn't be new to, say, the reading Buddhist publics in Southeast Asia, for example. But I was wondering how popular the term, just like what Jens was asking earlier, in different time period, for example, say by the 70s and 80s, especially 60s, 70s, and 80s, when Rensheng or Renjian Fojiao became almost like a dominant discourse, right? In the kind of transnational circulation of Buddhist ideas, mainly coming out of Taiwan and a lot of these groups in Taiwan, and in which Renjian or Rensheng Fojiao became almost the lingua franca, right? And then out of a sudden, into especially the later part of the 20th century, then everyone's suddenly, to start talking about Buddhism using this Renjian Fojiao, Rensheng Fojiao language, right? So I was wondering, if you have any thoughts on that kind of timeline for the frequency and usage and appearances of the term, say specifically in Malaysia and Singapore in the first half and the second half of the 20th century, and what do you think, the indications are? And if I may to kind of, add another question to it, I know that these reformist monks were critical of the so-called ritual monks. And at the same time, we know that in Southeast Asia, kind of dialect groups or dialect group networks were pretty essential, right, to the spread of Buddhism and to the very survival of these migrant monks, right? And so then in the clips that you were showing us, these monks didn't just speak Mandarin, they speak Mandarin in a heavily accented kind of Southern China, version of it. And have you detected any tension between them and the various dialect groups, who I assume, was actually the more influential during a certain time, right? So, yeah, thank you, Jack.
Right. Thank you so much for those two wonderful broad questions. I'll try my best to respond to them. Really excellent questions. I think I would respond to the second question first in terms of the language and dialect. I think that's a very fascinating question and something that I actually encountered also during my fieldwork. In fact, many of my respondents told me that, as you rightly pointed out, many of these migrant monks actually spoke Mandarin Chinese, which was not the language that was that common among the overseas Chinese communities, especially in the 1950s and 60s. In fact, in Singapore, the Mandarin Chinese, the Speak Mandarin campaign only kicked off in the 1970s. That's when more Chinese Singaporeans started to use Mandarin as their so-called Chinese language. So what happened was that when these migrant monks first arrived in Singapore, many of them had to rely on dialect translator to reach out to the Chinese communities, especially for instance, for Zhu Mo, he was in Penang, and of course we know that Penang is most of the Chinese in Penang actually spoke Hokkien. So at that time, he actually had a Hokkien translator with him. So it was quite an interesting process where he will lecture in Chinese, and then his disciples will translate it into Hokkien for the congregation. But of course, it's also important to note that many of his early disciples, both for Zhu Mo and Yan Pei, were more, I would consider, educated Chinese elites and intellectuals. So many of them could later on look at his writings and many of the works he published. So, many of the texts were also, in a way, many of the lectures were later transcribed and later published, in fact, as pre-distribution materials among the community. So I think you also raised a very important, really excellent question about whether there were tensions between these Mandarin-speaking Buddhist reformers and the migrant dialect monks. So I would say both yes and no. Many of the so-called reformers monks who spoke dialects, for instance, like Hong Chuan Fa Si, Guangxia Fa Si, who were from the Hokkien, Fujian, Minnan region, so they actually propagated Buddhist teachings in Hokkien, but because they were very much also influenced by the so-called reformist ideas in Republican China before they migrated to Southeast Asia. So they were actually very supportive of reformist monks like Zhu Mo and Yan Pei. But for the so-called dialect ritual spectators, then they became very critical, or in fact very wary of them, because they are those that they consider those that will be very harmful to the rice bowl, because they were criticizing such Jing Chan Fo Si, calling them unorthodox, profit-seeking monks. So they were actually not very happy with reformist monks such as Zhu Mo and Yan Pei. And so for the first question, I think that's an excellent question that I think we should explore further. So I don't think I have the final, I would say, safe conclusion to that. But from what I see from my sources, I would say that the idea of racial Fujiao emerged around, I would say, in the early 1920s by Taishi. And then this idea was brought to Southeast Asia, I would say, quite early. In fact, as early as in the 1920s in Taishi's visits to Southeast Asia. In fact, in the documents that I found in Taishi Dashi Quanji, he actually spoke about the idea of Rensheng Fojiao, as well as he also promoted such so-called ecumenical ideas during his talks to the overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. But then with the establishment of the Chinese Buddhist Association, the Zhonghua Fujiao Hui in Singapore, it became an important center for him to further promote his ideas. So they were actually printing and distributing Taishi's ideas. So I would say that the idea of racial Fujiao arrived quite early as in the 1920s and probably 1930s thereabout. While ideas of Rensheng Fujiao, I would say, arrived a lot later, because this idea became popularized initially by Yin Shun in Taiwan, I would say probably around the 1950s. And his Fuyan Jingse was one of the prominent organizations that was actually spreading this idea before the emerge of what I would consider mega temples in Taiwan that started to further disseminate this idea of Renjian Fujiao. So Yingshun's idea of Renjian Fujiao, I would say, probably became more popular in the 1950s, and later on his student, Yan Pei, brought this idea to Singapore after he migrated to Singapore in 1964. So I would say that Yan Pei is probably one of the earliest monastic that promoted this idea of Renjian Fujiao before the arrival of the major transnational Taiwanese organization in the 1990s or 2000s, around 2000s in Southeast Asia. So that's when the Taiwanese more, I would say, popular version of Renjian Fujiao promoted by Fo Guangshan, Tzu Chi, and Fa Gusan became more popular in Southeast Asia. So before that, Yingshun student Yan Pei was probably one of the earliest to promote it. And then I remember there's another prominent figure that actually promoted Renjian Fujiao in Singapore even before the arrival of this Taiwanese group. Was actually a Taiwanese man, Hou Zhong Fashi, who was a student of Yingshun. And he actually started the prominent Buddhist organization in Singapore, known as the if I remember correctly, Mahaprajna Buddhist Society, to promote Yingshun's idea of Renjian Fujiao. So yeah, I would say that the organization is lesser known because it's not that transnational or global as compared to the later Taiwanese organization that arrived in the 1990s and 2000s. And so I hope this answers your question. I hope that we can explore this issue further to really zoom in about how these ideas really became more popular, and also the various interpretation of, I would say, Renjian Fujiao in Southeast Asia. So thanks very much for your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. There was one more quick question in the chat, and then I'll turn it back over to Jens. It's just what were the boundaries of the Sichuan Chongqing wartime Buddhist region? What is that referring to? Thanks.
Oh, great. Thanks for your question. So what happened was that during the Sino-Japanese War, the Kuomintang were defeated in a major coastal region by the Japanese. So during the Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese actually occupied the major big cities, including, for instance, Nanjing, Shanghai, Fujian, Guangdong in the coastal region. And because of that, many of the Buddhists, in fact, the Kuomintang government, who was the government of the government of China at the time under Chiang Kai-shek, retreated to inland to Chongqing, the Sichuan region, to escape escape from the Japanese invaders. So at the time, many of the Buddhist monastics also retreated along with the Kuomintang government inwards to the Chongqing Sichuan area to escape from the Japanese invader who occupied the coastal region. So one of the most prominent Buddhist organizations in that region was actually the Sino-Tibetan Institute at that time. And if I remember correctly, the main teacher of the institute, Fa Jun, was actually a student of Taishi as well. So many of the prominent Buddhist monks who were connected to Taishi and Yingshun actually went to the Sino-Tibetan Institute, and then later on to some of the other organizations in the Chongqing region, and in fact the broader Sichuan region, to continue their so-called modernist Buddhist ideas, where they actually continue to conduct classes and gave Dharma lectures. So that was the so-called the retreat to Chongqing and Sichuan region during the Sino-Japanese War.
Thank you so much, Jack, for this wonderful talk. I really had a great and very informative evening. So I hope everybody else too. I want to thank everybody in the audience for attending the first lecture of our monthly series. And of course, I also want to express my gratitude to University of the West, to Fo Guangshan, Xilai Temple, and of course, with Rain for moderating today. Thank you all very much. But before we end, one last thing. The next lecture in our series will take place in about a month on November 20 at 6 p.m. The lecture was held by Dr. Rong Dao Lai, who just experienced her from McGill University. It has the title, Tracing the Tiantai Lineage in Southeast Asia. And there will be an abstract coming up on our homepage soon in our newsletter. So thank you, everyone. Goodbye, Zaijian, and have a wonderful evening.
And thanks again, Ian. And thanks everyone for coming. Thank you.